Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today with, again, another historic aircraft overview. The subject of Japanese floatplanes is a pretty interesting one. Of course, Japan as an island nation relied heavily on its floatplanes in several roles throughout the war. And today we are going to cover one of them. In fact, this might actually be one of the best, if not the best reconnaissance floatplane Japan had to offer. The Aichi E16A Zuiun. This aircraft sort of has an identity crisis. This is a reconnaissance floatplane that also wants to be a dive bomber, an auxiliary fighter, and was intended to be operated from battleships that were carrier hybrids. And as we discussed in the video about the C6N, the Japanese Navy relied heavily on its floatplanes for reconnaissance. Shipborne reconnaissance was almost exclusively undertaken by cruiser and battleship-operated floatplanes. These were the eyes and ears of the fleet. Whereas the previous generation of floatplanes still were exclusively biplanes, like the E8N or the F1M, Aichi had just backed itself the contract and was introducing a new shipborne monoplane reconnaissance bird, the E13A, allied codename Jake. And while the Jake was an excellent aircraft in its own right, Aichi actually developed a successor even before the E13 could enter service. Starting out first as a private venture, the Jake's successor carried the internal number AM-22. Its designers were Kishiro Matsuo and Yasuhiro Ozawa. Both were experienced engineers, with Matsuo already leading the design team that came up with the Jake, certainly helping with the design process. In fact, AM-22 kept all the positive aspects of the E13, but added further adaptability and much better performance. In fact, one of the previous specifications sent out by the Navy, 12 Shi, had asked for a two-seat reconnaissance seaplane before being changed again to a three-seater, which resulted in the end in the E13. Aichi could therefore use lots of the experience gained during the design process of the previous aircraft. When approached by Aichi, the Navy liked the design and made up a specification around AM-22 called Specification 16 Shi. And what the designers came up with was a rather sleek two-seat aircraft with large twin floats mounted below N-shaped struts and of all-metal construction except for the fabric-covered flight surfaces and a wooden tail. The omission of one crew member allowed the aircraft to be smaller than its predecessor. Whereas the E13 was 11.3 meters long and had a wingspan of 14.5 meters, AM-22 was 10.8 meters long and had a wingspan of only 12.7 meters. Despite the smaller dimensions, the new aircraft was slightly heavier than its predecessor, 2,945 kg on the E16 versus 2,642 kg on the Jake. The aircraft not only kept the long-range capabilities of its predecessor, but even exceeded them, with the new type having a range of 1,491 miles. AM-22 also kept the Jake's engine, the Mitsubishi Kinsei, known in Navy service as the Mk8. However, whereas the Jake fitted the Kinsei 43, which developed just a bit over 1,000 horsepower, the upcoming aircraft was to be fitted with the more powerful Kinsei 51, making 1,300 horsepower. The Mk8, or Kinsei as it was known in Army service, was one of Japan's most produced radial engines. The small 14-cylinder radial was available in different power settings and could be found in bombers, fighters and seaplanes. Most interesting, however, was the aircraft's intended use not only as a reconnaissance aircraft, but also to give it limited dive bombing capabilities. Whereas previous generations of shipborne reconnaissance aircraft had the capability to fit small bombs, these were biplanes, with their wings generating so much drag and their engine being just so weak that they weren't able to achieve high dive speeds in the first place. The AM-22, being a monoplane with a much more powerful engine, was more streamlined and could achieve higher dive speeds. To better control these, hydraulically operated dive brakes were fitted into the front struts that would deploy sideways into the airstream. While it was planned to ultimately replace the Jake on the cruiser operating that plane, it was also planned as a carrier-operated reconnaissance aircraft. For these reasons, the AM-22 was fitted with foldable wings to allow tighter storing on board these ships. The first prototype, designated Navy Experimental 16 Shi Reconnaissance Seaplane, was completed and test flown in May of 1942, specifically on the 22nd. It was armed with three 7.7mm machine guns, two in the wings and a single one operated in a rearwards firing position by the observer/radio operator. From pure performance figures, the aircraft was satisfactory. The only really big problem were the dive brakes. They did not perform satisfactorily. Severe flutter was encountered when deploying these devices. The problem was that unlike other countries that used slotted or Swiss cheese dive brakes, the prototype E-16's ones were solid. Rectifying this issue would cost time and was only solved when the dive brakes were perforated. Unfortunately, just a few weeks after the E-16's first flight, an event would occur that would influence not only the E-16's design, but also cause an uproar in the entire Japanese Navy: the Battle of Midway. The disastrous loss of 4 fleet carriers that day would prove the turning point of the Pacific War. Japan didn't have that many carriers in the first place, and replacing these losses ultimately was very, very difficult, especially if you remember that the small island nation didn't have nearly as much resources than the United States. This also influenced the E-16. And indeed, the story of the E-16 cannot be told without mentioning the ships it was intended to be operated from. And as Japan sought to replace the losses of Midway under any circumstance, this would see one of the most unusual carrier conversions in the history of naval warfare. The two battleships of the Ise class, Ise and Hyuga, were both super dreadnoughts built during the First World War. Although extensively modified during refits prior to World War II, they were relegated as obsolete units due to their age. However, they were rebuilt again in 1943. This saw the removal of the aft 14-inch gun turrets, and in their place came a large hangar space and catapult facilities to allow aircraft to be launched from there. The two ships were essentially turned into battleship carrier hybrids. The two even older dreadnoughts of the Fuso class, Fuso and Yamashiro, were at first planned to undergo this conversion as well, but they would remain in their battleship configuration for the rest of their careers. The E-16 was one of the aircraft selected to be operated from these hybrids, together with a catapult-launched version of the D-4Y Judy dive bomber. Another ship the Zuiun was intended to be operated from was the heavy cruiser Mogami. Heavily damaged at Midway, Mogami was repaired and subsequently extensively modified in a similar manner as the Issei sisters, removing the aft gun turrets to make space for a large floatplane handling facility. In the meantime, the E-16 would go into production, getting the designation E16A1 with the nickname Zuiun, or Auspicious Cloud. It was introduced in February of 1944. When the Allies first encountered the E-16, it was given the nickname Paul. The production aircraft differed from the prototypes in a slightly enlarged wingspan to 12.81 meters, and most notably, a change in armament, with two 20mm Tomioka Type 99 cannons with 100 rounds per gun, replacing the 7.7s in the wings, and the rearward-facing 7.7 being replaced with a much more potent 13mm machine gun. The engine was also switched from a Kinsei 51 to a Kinsei 54. As soon as pilots got to fly the E-16, they knew they were at the controls of one of the most potent aircraft in its class. Not only did the E-16 have a 63 km per hour higher top speed than the E-13, it could cruise over 100 km per hour faster as well, meaning that searching of a specific sector could be done much faster without sacrificing range. The aircraft was also stable, handled well, and was surprisingly maneuverable. The potent armament also meant the aircraft could be used as an emergency fighter if necessary. The lack of a trapezoidal release mechanism for the fuselage-mounted bombs meant that Zuiuns could only attack in shallow glide bombing runs with their underbelly bombs, or they would risk striking their own propeller with their ordnance. Steeper dives could be flown when smaller bombs were mounted on the wings. The Zuiun proved itself a very versatile and good aircraft in service. It not only was better than the aircraft it replaced, it was also better than foreign counterparts, which were often much slower and less well armed than the Paul. However, all this meant very little, as Japan was facing increasing numbers of better armored and armed fighters that completely outclassed the Zuiun itself. This is why Zuiuns, despite their impressive performance for floatplane, suffered heavy losses during their rather short service career, meaning it could never really show its potential. The 634th Kokutai, for example, supplied E-16s to operate them from the Issei sisters, and they even trained on these ships, but ultimately it seems they never operated their Zuiuns in combat. During the Leyte Gulf operation, during which Issei and Hyuga took part in, they didn't operate their aircraft as their captain had given them to land-based units instead, which, well, let's be fair, probably was for the better. The prospect of a battleship carrying large aircraft handling facilities was problematic at best. The Battle of Savo Island had impressively shown why aircraft hangars, particularly enclosed ones, were problematic on ships that were first and foremost designed to do surface warfare. The American cruisers sunk during that battle burned fiercely after their F-gas fuel tanks were set ablaze. Now imagine that on a ship much bigger and that is still expected to maintain its full surface fighting capability, like the Issei twins. Likewise, Mogami also never operated Zuiuns before that ship was sunk. All this meant that Zuiuns were relegated to fly their missions from land-based units. While they had some successes during nighttime patrol and harassment operations, the aircraft suffered heavily at the hands of Allied fighters. Their numbers dwindled even more when they were used during kamikaze attacks. For all the potential and impressive performance figures the aircraft offered, it was too little too late. All in all, only 256 Zuiuns were built. This includes the prototypes, as well as a single example of an improved E16A2, fitted with the 1560 horsepower Mitsubishi Mk8P Kinsei 62. To my knowledge, not a single E16 has survived. And this brings us to the end of this video. I hope you maybe learned something and enjoyed the video, and I will see you in the next one.